Good evening, this is Evening Super Prime Time on ET, now India's #1 business news channel, and you're watching a special edition of India Tonight. I'm Sandeep. Gurumurthi. Joining me in Delhi is my colleague Supriya, Shrinate with the big budget debate this Tuesday evening.
Indeed, and which is why we're going to put the focus firmly on what we believe perhaps will be the calling shot in this budget, and that is demonetisation drive and its impact on the big fiscal exercise. To put it all in context, we're joined by Pronab Sen, Sadanand Dhume and Surjit Bhalla. Thanks very much each one of you for being with us. Surjit Bhalla, if I may begin to talk to you about the entire budget exercise. Has demonetisation it had set out to achieve a lot of things, but primarily among that was a more transparent, a less black economy. Has that motive been achieved?
Well, we'll find out. Demonetization is a long-term process. We can't have one of the most significant events and we try and evaluate in 2 months or 3 months or even 6 months. But let me emphasize, and I'm trying to get at the point you asked. Look, the backdrop of demonetization makes this budget about one of the most important budgets in the last 30 years. So there is absolutely no question in my mind that the backdrop of demonetization means that this budget cannot afford to be and should not be business as usual. If it is business as usual, then I think it's a massive failure.
Sadanand Dhume, comment on that. So basically what Surjit Bhalla is saying is that this cannot be another Arun Jaitley budget. We've got business as usual budgets over the last 2 years and you've been critical of them, both the previous full budgets that this government has presented. So would you agree that this cannot be another Jaitley budget?
I would, and those are your words. I would agree, and but it cannot be, yet may well be, right? So I agree with Surjit that demonetization has dramatically altered the landscape. Demonetization has really raised very serious issues about economic governance and this government's will to reform. In a way, it has kind of wiped out much of the goodwill that had been generated in 2013 and 2014. Toward Mr. Modi and towards the general economic management of India. So I agree that it calls out for a profound reformist, bold budget, but I'll believe that when I see it.
We'll all believe it only when we see it. Pronab Sen, what's your sense? Do you expect to see a significant overhang of demonetization in the budget? Is the entire exercise going to be, going to be undertaken with this huge overhang of demonetization?
Well, it's bound to. I mean, the demonetization has had effects, and I don't see any way the budget can ignore those effects and try to rectify some of the damage that's been caused.
So one thing is certain, that this budget is happening in the overhang of demonetization. It cannot be business as usual budget. It has to perhaps set the scars of demonetization right. Dr. Bhalla, will this budget then be an exercise, and what will it really need to do to diminish those scars of demonetization? Perhaps a well-intended move, but hasn't worked out as planned.
Well, look. Let's leave judgment of demonetization, whether it's worked out as planned or not, to the side. We don't know as yet. And let's leave aside the effect on GDP growth. We also don't know that as yet, and perhaps we can comment on it in a few minutes. The fact remains that apart from demonetization, the other significant effect or likelihood of this budget of being different than any other, at least for the last 2 decades, is that there won't be much discussion of indirect taxes. Most of our budgets was, okay, let's hike the cigarette tax here, let's decrease the excise duty on sugar there, and it was what I call a Tweedledum and Tweedledee budgets. All the time, you shifted marginally the tax rates on one item or the other. We introduced service tax, and then we increased service tax by 0.5%, and so on and so forth. That is gone. So what is this budget going to do? So this budget has to address, I think, two fundamental issues. First, what do we do on direct taxes, both personal income as well as corporate, and both of them, the compliance in both of them was very much in the backdrop, was very much, if you will, behind the demonetization move. And the second is what to do with our inefficient delivery of welfare services, particularly things like PDS, NREGA, this subsidy, that subsidy. So therefore, what I expect this budget to at least address in a very significant fashion, one, whether we have a redistributive policy which is a hell of a lot more efficient than what we have. And the Chief Economic Advisor, Arvind Subramaniam, has already not only hinted, has said aloud that universal basic income or perhaps targeted basic income or conditional basic income will be a major item addressed in this economic survey. So we should expect some of the fallout of that into the budget. And the second is what do you do about our deplorable state of compliance and tax revenue generation in both personal income taxes and corporate income taxes.
You're actually giving me two cues, and I'm tempted to take both of those, but I will begin with growth and then go on to taxes and what elbow room there is. Sadanand Dhume, come in on that. We spoke about the scars of demonetization, but it almost seems that one is budgeting in the dark as far as Budget 2017 is concerned. The CSO says that the impact is not yet known, and yet growth will be down from 7.6 to 6.6%. Sorry, according to the IMF, the CSO says the impact is not known. Macro indicators are giving, a completely different picture. Empirical evidence seems to prove auto sales are down 30, 40, 50% in rural areas. What does one make of, the lack of evidence, the lack of details? Are we budgeting in the dark? And where do you think growth is going to settle on account of all of this?
Yeah, I do think that to a certain degree that is true. The full contours of what has happened have not become clear. But the way I look at it is a little bit different. I see this in terms of two storylines. You have the economic storyline and you have the political storyline. Now the economic storyline, frankly, has been one of loss of credibility, a sense that the ship is not being manned very competently. You've seen a blow to the credibility of the RBI, for instance. You've seen the reform credentials of this government questioned in a way they hadn't before. But the political story makes this more interesting because you have this run up to the UP elections, which are really the semi-finals for general elections in 2019. Now the hope is that they can find some kind of sweet spot, which is good economics and also good politics. Perhaps reducing certain tax rates and so on. The fear is that the story is going to be driven by the political story, which is always the case. And that means that instead of demonetization leading to a better, more reformist budget, demonetization may in fact set the stage for a worse, more populist budget.
Right, you're saying demonetization may set the stage for a populist budget, and that concern is very much there. Let me come to you, Surjit Bhalla, before I go to Pronab Sen as well, which is on where do you see growth settling? I know we're sort of shooting in the dark, and so is the government, and probably Pronab Sen is best equipped to answer that, having been the chief statistician himself. But what's your sense, given the fact that given the fact that the CSO hasn't given us too much of numbers to work with? How bad could it get for this financial year, and how much of a pressure is that going to put on the government to go in for what Sadanand calls a populist budget?
Yeah, let me address that very directly, and let me disagree very strongly with my good friend Sadanand, that I think there are very few arguments that this will be a populist budget, and perhaps we can discase it. I just think there is almost a zero basis for this being a populist budget in the conventional sense of spend more and spend wastefully more. There is certainly no evidence whatsoever in the last 2 years that this government has been ever close to, even within miles of being a populist government. So that we can, if you will, shift aside. The second one on the growth rate, which I think will affect the budget, and it's impossible to think that it won't. But, you know, I think all of us, first of all, you're very right. We do not have the CSO giving us much guidance on what to expect. So let me turn you to something in an extreme way controversial, which is that don't be surprised if the CSO estimate turns out to be right. And the reason the CSO estimate is more likely to be right than wrong, which is somewhere around 7% GDP growth, is that agricultural growth, which all of us and most of the doomsayers expected that Rabi planting acreage would go down, is up actually 8%. So agriculture is very likely to show about an 8% growth rate year on year, which will, if you will, add to and therefore negate many of the downward effects, very real downward effects of demonetization. So this is, remember last year, and the comparison always with GDP growth is last year. That's what the base is. And last year's base in agriculture was very, very low, which was that it was a drought year, and therefore, you know, 8%, 7 or 8% agricultural growth, which adds about 100, 120 basis points to GDP growth. So, you know, don't be surprised. I don't think the GDP growth is going to be that negative a factor going in. Now, one explanation for us all being very pessimist and thinking there's a populist budget is that all the acreage data, etc., the government is lying. So that's always a recourse we have. Oh, this is all fudge data. I don't buy into that. But if you're going to make that argument, then we don't have any discussion, because then anything is possible.
Let's not make that argument, but let me throw it to the former chief statistician. I'm guessing someone who would probably have a better idea on what number the government is likely to report for FY16, for FY17 rather, which is Pronab Sen. What's your sense? Slowdown in growth vis-a-vis the claims of increase in tax collections that the finance ministry has sort of talked about. The IMF has cut the forecast by a good percentage point. People like Manmohan Singh have said we're likely to see a cut of almost 2% for as far as growth estimates are concerned. What's your own view? How bad is it going to get?
You see, if you think about the immediate impact, it may not be as large in the third quarter of this current fiscal year. I think you're going to see more of it play out over the fourth quarter and in the first couple of quarters of next year. Now, when one talks about the damage, we are really talking about the damage till things come back to normal. And we really don't have a sense as to how long that is going to take. So when IMF brings it down by a percentage point, what it is saying in effect that the damage is really a little bit more than 2 percentage points over the last 2 quarters. That's what it's saying, because it's averaging it out over the year, and it could be larger yet. The longer term play will really depend upon how quickly systems fall back into place, and this could play out over several months, and it will certainly be playing out as we go through the initial rollout of the budget.
All right, just hold your thoughts there, because Sadanand, I'm going to take it to yet another argument that is being made as far as demonetization is concerned, which is loss of credibility from the RBI. Not just experts, but people within the RBI believe that the government has infringed upon its own autonomy, on its own credibility. From a foreign investor's point of view, is that a concern that is being, you know, voiced at this point in time as the union budget is being presented?
The short answer is yes, but before that I sort of get into that, I want to sort of get to the nub of my disagreement with Surjit over here. Now, I think both of us obviously want a reformist budget. Both of us would like to see very similar things: streamlining of subsidies, cut down in Narega, privatization, and so on. Where we disagree is on the likelihood of this. My view is that demonetization has been a huge political earthquake. You're heading into very important state elections to be followed by national elections in 2019. Given this context, can we seriously imagine that this government is, for instance, going to press the accelerator on privatization? I'd say no. Can you seriously expect them to really, to slash Narega? I'd say no. In fact, they're probably going to boost it. Can we seriously expect any kind of deep-rooted labor law reform? The answer again is extremely unlikely. So you have a government that has in any case been quite cautious about pushing reforms that people agree are necessary but may have political fallout. My argument is that it is going to be even more cautious about things like cutting subsidies because of the political earthquake caused by demonetization.
Surjit Bhalla, you want to take on Sadanand Dhume, your good friend, on that, because he believes that demonetization is going to egg the government on to be far more populist than reformist because they have to soothe frayed nerves.
Well, I have a very different interpretation how you soothe frayed nerves, and populism is certainly not one of them. But Sadanand may be right, I may be right. But I think the important point Sadanand is making, where I completely agree, this is a political earthquake. This is an economic earthquake. I mean, this is an earthquake such that we haven't seen that in any country ever. Now, what are the, if you will, the immediate outcomes of these earthquakes? First, on the economic side, as I mentioned, it's unlikely to be very large for various reasons. The net effect is unlikely to be very large, helped, if you will, by good weather. But what's a politician if he or she cannot benefit from good weather? The second, surprisingly, and it surprised all of us, and let me not speak for Sadanand or Pronab, but certainly surprised me as to how politically popular demonetization has been. So therefore, I mean, it touched a nerve, and there'll be books written on this, there'll be PhD theses written on this as to what happened, and obviously the state elections in UP and Punjab, and most importantly UP, are very important. This is an ongoing, this is a natural experiment provided for, if you will, social analysts, for economists, for sociologists. This is a fantastic experiment, and to me, I am very surprised as to how well it's turning out to be, politically and economically. We would not have forecast that it would be as little damaging. Now, last point I want to add on that, and that is, I think, critical from my side, is that given the risk that Modi government has taken with demonetization, i.e. unleashing both a political as well as an economic earthquake, then are they going to sit aside and say, okay, I'll just be, business as usual? So I think one of the biggest benefits of demonetization is going to be, or likely to be, or I would like it to be, a very non-traditional and non-populist approach to economic reform, i.e. we might very well get the economic reforms that we all wishing for.
Indeed, and I'm sure there's complete agreement on what are those economic reforms. Sadanand, before I come to you, I want to get a quick word in from Pronab Sen, because that's picking up on a point that both you and Dr. Surjit Bhalla made, which is on this political earthquake. Pronab Sen, what explains the reaction that we've seen? Surjit Bhalla also spoke about the fact that how it's taken everyone by surprise and how popular this decisions turned out to be. One thought there would be outrage. People would be out on the streets protesting against this move, the inconvenience caused across sections of society. What explains the lack of outrage on account of this demonetization? Is it just brilliant messaging by the government and the Prime Minister himself?
Well, the messaging has been absolutely perfect. It's been brilliant, in fact. I don't think there's any question about that. But I think there is also a sense among people that this is a burden which is being shared by everybody. So nobody feels as if he or she is being personally targeted. And that may have something to do with it. But, frankly, I think it's caused all of us a certain amount of surprise, given the fairly small things that we get agitated at and start burning things. This has been remarkable.
Remarkable, the disappearance of the agitative, the argumentative Indian. Probably Indians also found perverse pleasure in knowing that the man next door, his notion of his economic wealth has come down significantly and is probably notionally far poorer than you yourself are, and that's the reason why people aren't out on the streets. Sadanand Dhume, we've spoken about the fact that it may or may not be a populist budget, but given the constraint, what's the best case scenario, given the track record that we've seen in this government? What is it that the government can do, which is not necessarily bold, but it will still be effective? What can it do to get the consumption story back on track? Because much of our growth over the last decade or so has been consumption-led and not investment-led. So what is it that the government can do, which is not going to be bold, disruptive, and yet effective?
I mean, my best guess on that is that you're going to see some kind of lowering and rationalization of taxes, both corporate taxes and personal and income tax, because that kind of has the sweet spot of making some economic sense, but also being part of this political story. To your larger point about why this is popular, I mean, I'm not sure why people find this surprising. Indian economic history is full of examples of awful economic decisions that were very popular with voters. I don't recall any revolt when Indira Gandhi decided to nationalize the banks. I don't recall these terrible labor laws that ended up hampering Indian development being objected to by people. The fact is that you're able to make decisions that capture the public imagination, but the public imagination may not be always in tune with the best economic policy advice.
All right, fair point indeed. But Surjit, Bhalla, if I may come to you and talk to you about the tax bit, and there is a large expectation out there that it is time that the 1997 tax slabs could be reviewed, and it could happen in this budget itself. Is that your sense as well? Do you expect taxes to be tweaked, both corporate as well as direct taxes?
Yeah, first let me just mildly disagree with Sadanand again, I'm afraid. I don't think, in my personal view and personal opinion, that the popularity or unpopularity of demonetization is at all comparable to what we've suffered under banking nationalization, as well as labor laws, as well as God knows how many laws we've had, which are bad. Matter of fact, one is trained to think of good laws that we've had for very long. So I think this one is a code breaker, is unlike other such indignities, and this might actually lead to a lot of reform. So that's my immediate answer. Now on to the tax slabs as well as tax rates. Look, we had the last time we had any adjustment to personal income tax rates was in 1997. When they were reduced to 10, 20, and 30%. And after that, the corporate tax rate at that time was 35% and then got reduced to 30% in 2005. So basically for the better part of the last 20 years, we've tinkerized with slabs, not changed the rates at all. And we've put in a cess here, a surcharge there, expand this little bit here and put in this little bit there. It's Tweedledum and Tweedledee for the better part of 20 years. Has it served us well? It hasn't. Tax compliance in India, personal income tax compliance, is one of the lowest in the world. It's something like 25 to 30%. That is, we can easily triple our tax revenue if everybody paid taxes. So everybody will not pay taxes, but it does suggest that there's a large room to grow, to increase. Now, I haven't heard anybody ever make the argument, and I hope none of my fellow panelists makes it, that in order to increase compliance, we have to increase tax rates. Absolutely not. In order to increase compliance, we have to keep tax rates the same. Equally ridiculous. So therefore, the only way we can move forward on this, and we must move forward on this, is by decreasing tax rates, not slabs. And that is what I think should happen, and perhaps because of demonetization, such a surgical strike on tax rates might indeed happen.
All right, a surgical strike on tax rates might indeed happen, and we'll be the ones celebrating it the most. But Sadanand Dhume, I want to take the focus away from taxes and take it on to fiscal deficit, because if tax collections are to be believed, then the coffers are being filled better. What has demonetization done as far as the fiscal deficit contour is concerned? Do you believe it's going to help us in bridging the fiscal deficit more than it perhaps would have?
The short answer is we don't know for sure, but I doubt it very much. Because whatever, uptick that you've had, you have to discount the loss of economic growth and so on that we're going to see. So, I mean, frankly, we're all in the dark over here. We have to wait for a while to see what statistics come in. But it's certainly true that this government, one of the things that it has done quite well is maintain fiscal discipline. So I'd be curious to see whether they decide to continue to maintain fiscal discipline, or decide that these are circumstances under which they decide to sort of let go of that script.
Okay, let me get closing comments as we wrap this debate up. Pronab Sen, one of the proposals that is being talked about, and it was Swami who first mooted this, and that Swaminathan Aiyar, just to clear the air, was, the stock that money recovered should be returned to the common man in some form, maybe a cash transfer or some such form, to win back the goodwill of the common man who's been inconvenienced on account of this demonetization drive. Is that too simplistic a solution? Is it feasible at all, according to you, Pronab Sen?
Well, frankly, I think it's possibly the best thing that the government can do at this point in time. Because, what has happened over the last 2 months is, for a lot of people, their savings have been eroded very, very significantly. And there is now uncertainty about their ability to spend in the future. Restoring that ability on an emergency basis, I think, is not a bad idea at all.
Surjit, Bhalla, let you have the last word. Where is the money going to come from is a big question, because it appears as if the entire money that's been demonetized is now back in the system, and the central bank, for some strange reason, seems reluctant to go public with how much money has come back into the system. But assuming that there is some money to be given away, would that be a political masterstroke for the Prime Minister to say, here's the Kala Dhan that's now coming back into the accounts of the common man of this country?
Yeah, look, I completely disagree with that approach. I'm assuming all the money comes back, so there isn't any immediate Kala Dhan. But there is a lot of Kala Dhan which will now become Safed Dhan, which is that it will now come into the tax net, your taxes will go up, and that will allow various positive things to happen. So the fact that all the money is returned, that was mostly, maybe the government fanned it a little bit, but that was a creation of us analysts and, TV stations, and myself included. I'm not blaming you. But I think that's if the entire exercise of demonetization was, I'll get some Kala Dhan of 1 lakh crores or 2 lakh crores, I would say, forget it. I think the real gains are the increased tax revenues in perpetuity that the demonetization will help bring about. So for me, that's where the real catch is. That's where the real benefit is of demonetization.
All right, on that positive note, it's time to end this debate. Completely out of time on this budget debate edition. But thanks very much, Sadanand Dhume, Surjit, Bhalla and Pronab Sen, for joining us on a very special show.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.